The Afghani operation is the biggest one in the history of the CIA, and they managed to divert, biggest in every sense, including the fact the largest heroin smuggling ring left behind. And they managed to keep it from, not secret, but keep it from being a focal point of debate for the 6 major years that it was run.
How could it have been bigger than Vietnam? Well, Vietnam was a CIA operation for years before the Army came in. And
Vietnam became the Vietnam War with U.S. Army, U.S. Air Force, billions of dollars. Laos had always been cited as the CIA's biggest war. Vietnam became an overt war. Laos remained a CIA secret war. And the hundreds of millions of dollars there, supported with Air Force bombing and everything. But Afghanistan is... They haven't published the figure. I've never been able to find anyone who confident, like the archives, National Security Archives, Scott Armstrong in Washington, a solid figure on how much they've spent in Afghanistan, but it's in the billions.
John,
biggest in the history.
Let's go into Afghanistan in some detail. I read in the New York Times just this morning that the Reagan administration was bragging that they refused to compromise with the Soviet Union to pull out their support for the Afghan rebels in exchange for the Soviets pulling out. So let's see who the U.S. actually was supporting in Afghanistan over the last years, what of the rebel forces, how they were supporting them, and what the effects of this have already been and might be as we now are moving to a new era for Afghanistan that could be total chaos.
It looks like the Lebanization of Afghanistan, with all these different groups.
First of all, there's all these different rebel groups. Who is the U.S. supporting out of the whole spectrum?
I'm going to hedge a little bit because this is not an area of my primary expertise, and I have not been able to travel there and look at it like I did Nicaragua and El Salvador and Angola and all of that. But you essentially have it. We do have it. The Admiral Turner, when I debated him at Colby College, he was boasting about that covert action, that he had started it, and citing it as an example of a successful covert operation. They set it in motion, and then eventually it led to the Soviets having to withdraw their troops. The game that they're playing, essentially the U.S., the parallel to Vietnam is significant. We invaded, they invaded, each created governments that invited us in, so to speak. The difference is in the breakup, of course, that the NLF would not compromise in Vietnam. The Tom Polgar scandal we've talked about before, the chief of station hoping they would give the U.S. a break. And they had no reason to. They had the U.S. down and dirty, and were going to humiliate us as effectively as they could. This is essentially what Reagan is doing in Afghanistan, but the difference is that in Vietnam, the other side had created a very cohesive force in an orderly way to move in and take power and administrate and run the country, the NLF. And Hanoi and the government and everything. What we've been doing in Afghanistan is just pure and simple shotgun destabilization, funding anybody that's got a group, giving them arms through Pakistan, every kind of group, as you say, the Lebanization, so that now we've won in the sense that Reagan is crowing and Turner is crowing and Carter is crowing. You heard that on the news yesterday, that his policies had been vindicated and all of that. And the Russians are pulling out, admitting that they made a big mistake. In fact, they're probably being more candid than we were when we pulled out of Vietnam.
Right.
We tried to say it was an honorable this and everything. They're just saying flat, we made a mistake, a tragic mistake. But we have not created a force, or a government, or a movement, or anything that believes in anything to step into the vacuum. I debated, or I thought I was going to debate an Afghani professor at the World Affairs Conference in Boulder last year, because he was paid working for the VOA and U.S. propaganda arm, so I presumed he was bought and paid for. And he kept telling me, just let me finish my sentence, so to speak. And I did, and what he said is what the powers have done is condemned Afghanistan to eternal violence and conflict.
Yes, it looks like it's going to be horrible.
They're pulling out, and this side is not going to agree to relent, and the Soviets are going to see what they would call a necessity to keep arming the other side. This is where you get into a test, if you will, of Gorbachev's sincerity and Bush's, kinder, gentler, goodness in the nation. Do they really mean it? They're trying to convince the world that the Cold War is winding down. Doonesbury's already told us the Cold War is over. It isn't. Now, the danger, of course, is that people are so eager, craving for hope and craving for peace. It doesn't take much. As dynamic as the peace movement arguably is in the United States and Europe, for example, it sure doesn't take much for a president to get up there and just 3 words. Kinder, gentler, and then the goodness and greatness, 4 words. And people, oh wow,
Yeah. Whereas the actual policies are to keep violence and covert operations and secret wars going. So your point about the U.S. intervention in Afghanistan, rather than negotiating a peaceful settlement or negotiating some sort of a governmental structure, we just supported any forces whatsoever to create chaos in the region to humiliate the Soviet Union. That was the goal and continues to be the goal of the Bush administration, that continues to fund the Afghan rebels to make sure there's more murder, chaos, etc.